We've almost completed our little fruit bowl example here. What I'd like to do before I output this to a final mesh object is to add a little bit of thickness because it's got an infinitely thin wall here and that's not very believable. Luckily, there's a modifier for that. I'll select the object, go to the modifier stack, and at the top of the stack I can now add, and the one I want is called shell. So click on the modifier list and scroll down and choose shell. And now we've got a little bit of thickness there, as you can see on the rim. And we've got an inner and outer amount here. We can adjust those values. I don't really need an outer amount, but I'll give it an inner amount of, let's say, 0.2 inches. Another thing that's really worth mentioning at this point is that the order of operations in the stack is very important. We have a shell and a stretch, and the order in which they are placed is going to have an effect on the end result. And we can see this better in the ortho views. I'll go back Alt-W into the front view and get in real close on the rim there. And although stretch and shell are not really super dependent on one another, we will get a slightly different result depending upon the order of operations. And we can change the stacking order simply by dragging and dropping. Just click and hold and then drag, and you'll get a blue line to indicate where you're going to drop that particular modifier. And if I release this now, what I've done here is I have made the shell happen earlier than the stretch. And we get a slightly different result here at this boundary, at the rim. But we would get really different results if we started moving things around into the lower parts of the stack. So let's say, for example, I took that stretch and I moved it down below the volume select. And now more of that object is getting cut off because the stretch had an effect on the shape before it was being selected by the volume select. So the order here is important. I'm going to put this back the way I had it. And now I've got the stretch directly below the shell. All right, so this is a procedural object. Let's go back out to our perspective view with Alt-W. And it's already saved currently as this file. If I want to actually load this into a master scene, let's say I want to put it into my apartment loft, then it's best practice to actually convert it to a so-called editable object or a collapsed stack. And when you do that, you delete all the instructions that created the object, and you're just left with the object itself. And the old analogy for this is baking a cake. If we select that object and go into its modifier stack, we're seeing the recipe for this cake. Once we convert it to editable poly or editable mesh, we bake the cake. And as you know, you cannot unbake a cake. So I'm going to convert this, and that's going to be a destructive act. And that will remove all of these instructions, and I will be left with a raw mesh object that's a simple collection of points on a surface. And that will increase the file size. It'll take up more space on disk, but it will probably use up less memory because it doesn't have to calculate all of this stuff. It will load more quickly, and we will have better performance in general. To convert to an editable object or collapse the stack, right-click on the object or right-click anywhere in the view with the object selected. And you'll get a pop-up menu. It's called the quad menu because it could potentially have 4 sides to it. We're only seeing 2 of those right now. In the quad menu in the lower right corner is Convert To, and you can convert to different types of objects. In this course, we're going to be using editable poly because that is a more advanced polygon mesh object. Editable mesh is old and doesn't have as many cool features, so we're going to be using Convert to Editable Poly. Once I release the mouse, now as you can see in the modifier stack, there is no more stack. There's no more sphere. There's no more stretch. All of my procedural modifiers have been deleted, and I've baked the cake. And you can't tell all the ingredients of a cake by eating it. So there's no way for us to know how this object was created. Once it's been baked or converted to an editable poly, it's now a raw mesh object with no information as to how it was created. If I save the file now, and if I save over the top of this existing document, I will lose all those instructions. I will permanently erase all of those modifiers. And that's a very bad practice. You never want to erase a procedural model by overwriting the file. Instead, you want to save it out to a new file and have that file labeled appropriately so that you will know by looking at a list of files which ones have been permanently converted and which ones still have their procedural elements intact. So I'm going to save this out now. Save as to a new file name, and I'll call it collapse modifier stack collapsed. And that way, if I ever need to get back to those parameters, I can by loading in the other scene file. Cool. So that's a chapter devoted all to just the basics of the modifier stack. As we progress through the course, we will be using the modifier stack in great detail and to great effect. All right, we're going to move on now to the next chapter on spline modeling.